ahead and get started. So last week we went through kind of an overview of the New Testament, the different writers, 7 to 9 different writers, the time frame it was written in, late 40s, early 50s AD through 90 AD with and Revelation. We talked about the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then from Romans through Jude. Again, the order is from longest letter to shortest letter, right? So that was the order. We kind of talked about that concept. So today, what I want to do is we're going to spend the whole night talking about Paul, the letters of Paul, and we'll see how far we get because there's so much good stuff. And again, we talked about Paul wrote the majority of the New Testament, right? So as we dive into Paul's letters, they're really going to help us out. And we talked about a little bit of Romans last week, just to get an idea of what we were talking about from a letter point. Because again, these letters from the book of Romans through Jude are letters. They were letters to either churches or individuals. They were letters that were written sometimes for moral issues that they were facing, maybe doctrine issues, or just to deal with certain things that are going on, right? So as we talk about Paul, there's a couple things we need to know about Paul. So again, the Apostle Paul, I'm not going to cover his story a lot because most of you know who Paul is. Again, he's Saul, road to Damascus. That's the Paul we're talking about. So when we look at the letters of Paul, what a lot of times if you'll hear me say the Pauline letters, what I mean is not a person named Pauline, but it's the letters written by Paul. Okay. And again, he wrote the majority of the New Testament. Of all the authors, he wrote more than anyone else. And the Pauline letters have a lot of the similar format in how they're written, which makes sense. If you're going to write something, you're going to write it like you normally would. And you're starting and you're ending. So his greetings and his endings are normally around the same. He'll say something like, "Hey, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. Paul in slavery and bondship and a prisoner of Christ." He introduces himself over and over to the individuals that he's writing the letters to. So like the book of Romans, right? He introduces himself to the Romans, the church of Rome, as Paul is servant to Jesus Christ, and begins to explain a little bit of that. And then he ends a lot of his letters with greetings, because one of the things I think we forget is that Paul has a relationship with the majority of the churches that he writes to. He's either planted or co-planted or at least visited, other than Rome, and we'll talk about another one. Visited these churches, so he knows a lot of the individuals, and plus he's trying to place. So if you kind of think about it in our day and age, right now, it would be very similar. If I went to travel somewhere, or if I wrote in my position as I was a youth director, a lot of you know that. So a lot of the churches know who I am. So if I was to write a letter to another church, I would say, "Hey, by the way, greet so-and-so and so-and-so from the church. They were really dear to me," you know. So it's kind of that same concept again, because Paul has been to these places. He also, in Pauline writings, he does a lot of the things that we're really words we need to pay attention to, like therefore. Therefore, a lot of times comes at the beginning of a chapter. For example, I wrote down here Romans chapter 2, verse 1. He says, "Therefore, you have no excuse." Well, when he says therefore, what he's talking about is this concept of what I talked about in the first chapter of Romans chapter 1. And now I'm going to tell you what's to come of that argument, or what I was talking about Romans chapter 1. Okay? Because again, what we've got to remember when we read the Bible is that it wasn't originally written with verse numbers or chapter numbers. Those come much later as they begin to put the Bible together. And we talked about kind of the canonization process last week. So when Paul originally wrote the book of Romans, he didn't have verse numbers and he didn't have chapter numbers. So as the Romans would read it, they would just be reading the end of chapter 1, what we see is at end of chapter 1 and in chapter 2, all in one setting. You and I, unfortunately, a lot of times what we're doing is we read chapter 1 and go, okay, I'm done with chapter 1, and then tomorrow I'm going to read chapter 2. So when you see the word therefore, recognize that you better go back and read what he's trying to tell you. He's talking about the grace, and that we need to not abuse grace, and all this stuff's going on. And then he says, and then therefore. So you've got to read all that to figure out what does he mean by that. So to understand, anytime you see that statement, you always read the preceding verses, and it may be the whole chapter. And then the other thing he likes to use a lot of rhetorical questions. Okay, what then shall we say? He repeats that phrase numerous times, specifically in the book of Romans. Okay, what then shall we say? It's almost like he's saying a therefore. He's saying, where sin abounds, grace abounds even greater. What then shall we say? Well, should we go on and sin even more? And then he'll say, well, no, of course not. We shouldn't. That's the kind of writer Paul is. So as we read Paul, we're looking for those things like therefore. We're looking for maybe rhetorical questions and recognize that he's trying to prove a point. He's trying to talk to us. Paul, above all things, again, we talked about last week, is a theologian. He's the reason we have the majority of our doctrine from the New Testament is because of Paul. So when we read Paul, sometimes we've got to recognize he's trying to lay out doctrine for us, especially like in the case of the book of Romans. Again, he had not visited Rome at that point. So he wrote the longest letter he wrote, in fact, the longest letter in the New Testament to the Roman people, because he had not visited there. So he's trying to lay out a baseline, theological baseline, a doctrine for them to understand, for the book of, or for the Romans to understand. So what I thought would be interesting is let's take a journey with Paul throughout, and I'll kind of explain the map here as we go through. And this will help us because one of the things I talked about last week is that the book of Acts overlays the majority of the New Testament, meaning that what happens in Acts chapter 1, 2, 3, all the way through, right? We can find in the majority of the letters, or at least find where they're talking about what is happening. And so the Paul journey is very incredible because and we'll start way over here on the right. You see Jerusalem here. So we'll start at the beginning. So Acts chapter 2 happens. If we remember Acts chapter 2, baptism of the Holy Spirit, right? Paul shows up on the scene. He's actually at the scene when Peter and John are brought to the colonnades. We've talked about that, the portico, Solomon's columns, right? And Saul is at that moment. He's at the moment when Stephen is martyred. He's holding the cloak. So we see Saul there. Saul, then, the story says that Saul that receives letters from the leaders, right? The religious leaders of the day, to go to Damascus and to persecute the Christians, right? Or those of what they called the way. And so if we talk with Saul down here in Jerusalem, right? And pay no attention to the color lines right now, because this is his missionary journeys. But let's go up to Damascus. So on the road to Damascus, as he's going up there, at some point, this is where he meets Jesus. Okay. And if we remember the story, he meets with Jesus, Jesus blinds him, and he makes his way up to Antioch. Okay. Antioch is where he ends up getting ministered to, spending time with Jesus, specifically, not in the physical Jesus, but in prayer, in reading, and studying, and verifying that, yeah, you know what, this Jesus was the Messiah, going through what he knew of the Old Testament. And so from Antioch becomes his base of operation. In fact, as you kind of look, we'll talk about the first one, which is that pink purpley color. I don't know what color that is, but from Antioch, that's his first missionary trip. So he sets out, and actually he begins his journey, and I'd say it's a fairly short journey when you think about it. So he goes by boat, comes down into this area right here, then up to Galatia, Galatians, right? The book of Galatians, to the area of Galatia, spends time there, and then goes back the same route back into Antioch, and ends in Antioch, right? So when we talk about like the book of Galatians, that's where we're talking about the southern region. There's not a city of Galatia, but Galatia is an area. So when we talk about Galatians, this is what we're talking about. You can see that he spent a lot of time in that area, passing through that area, right? And then on the second journey, which is in the green, what we find is he leaves Antioch. He actually goes north at this point, goes to Tarsus. If you know anything about Paul from Tarsus, right? He goes up to Tarsus. Again, he travels through Galatia, okay? And then he goes into Ephesus, okay? Ephesians. This is where we find him going through. Let me get through here. So he goes to Ephesians. He spends a lot of time actually in in Ephesus, several months, comes up through into Philippi. So Philippians, the book of Philippians, Thessalonica, Thessalonian, right? Berea. He comes down again. We're following the green here, to Athens, to Corinth, comes through again, kind of goes back almost into Ephesus one more time, and then comes down to Caesarea, okay, and then back up, right, and then from there that's where he actually sets out on his I got mixed up here, on his third journey, which is again that blue. I think the blue, right? So he goes back again from Antioch is his launching point, right? So we think about that concept, and he goes through, and you'll see how he hits some of the same areas one more time. Okay, very important to understand, because what he's doing is, as he's journeyed, the first journey, he didn't really plant any churches that we know of. He started some works. He started to talk with people, right? He was kind of learning the ropes. And if you remember the story at all about the early part in the book of Acts of Paul, there's a lot of people that doubted him. They were very leery of Paul, thinking that he's come to persecute them. He's come to do something wrong, right? So his first journey was not as fruitful as his following journeys, the second and the third journey. In his second journey, he planted or was a co-planter of numerous churches. Again, like we're talking about Galatia, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, which is down here as well, right? All these different churches that he's planted or has really spent time with those individuals. And his third journey ends in Caesarea. And then from Caesarea, if we know our book of Acts, what ends up happening is he decides it's time to go to Jerusalem. Okay. So at the end of that third journey, he goes down to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem, that's where he goes to pray. He gets arrested, and then he makes his journey from Jerusalem to all the way to Rome. Okay. And that journey, that's that light green here, you kind of see that journey. And if you remember the book of Acts, right, you can kind of remember, well, they got shipwrecked. Where did they get shipwrecked? How did that happen right in this area, right? So these things that happen along the way, they're stopping points. And again, as they go up into Rome. And then from Rome, around 62 AD, somewhere in that time frame, he's actually released and was able to visit Crete again. He actually goes back to Crete with Titus, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And reinforces the churches in Crete, and then he goes back, gets re-arrested in prison again, and dies around. And I think I said this wrong last week. I think I said 62 last week. He dies. He's martyred around 67 AD. was the belief. He was actually beheaded in Rome around 67 AD. Okay, so that's kind of Paul's journeys. And for you and I, when we look at this, if you kind of know, you've got Africa down here, so you can kind of place where this is at. Hopefully, Africa, you see Italy, Rome, Italy, right? That there is, so you can kind of get an idea of where he was going. We're talking long term. I think his second journey, if I'm right, took 18 months. It was an 18-month journey because, again, he's not in a car. He's not riding horses either. He's walking, or he's taking boats from place to place. So he spends a lot of time in these areas. He'd go from place to place. And in certain areas like Ephesus, he stayed a long time in Ephesus, several months. And third journey, I think he spent two years during his journey in there. So it's a long time for Paul. And so again, as what Paul is doing is he's made all these connections, and then out of those connections, he begins to write letters, because again, he can't just visit them. He can't do what we're doing today, live streaming and be able to teach them and connect with them. So, so he meets Timothy, and I kind of want to point this out. So he meets actually Timothy, and Timothy becomes a leader in the Ephesus church. So Timothy comes up. Philemon, if we know him, that book, and we'll talk about that book as well. Colossae, which is Colossus, or Colossians, not Colossus. Colossians. He was actually a convert from Ephesus. They had met in Ephesus, and that's where he's from. And then Titus, which is the one of his final books that we know of. It's really about his time in Crete, although Titus was an individual that spent some time with Paul as well. And then, like I said, at the end of Paul's life, between 62 and 67 AD, he goes to Crete. Titus is the bishop of Crete. So he basically sets him up to lead the churches of Crete. Okay. So I wanted to give that overview, because now we're going to go into each book, and hopefully this map will, kind of, as you think of the journey that he's doing and how many times he goes through and spends time in the churches over and over again, you can kind of see why he's passionate about the churches that he's passionate about. So the first book I want to talk about, again, we're going to go in order of how they're written. And these are what I'd call the Pauline letters, or what are called Pauline letters. So these are the letters to the churches. We'll talk about Titus, Timothy, and Philemon at the end. So let's talk about the churches itself. So more than likely, there's a debate on which exactly is the first book. Galatians is probably the first book. If it's not Galatians, it's Thessalonians, right? But Galatians was probably the first book. Again, it was a church planted, and when I say church, understand we're not talking about a single church. We're talking about multiple churches. Most of these churches did not have a nice big building like we see today, or even the early by 300, 400 AD, or even 200 AD, right? They didn't have these big churches, so they were house to house, or sometimes they met at synagogues. But we're talking multiples. And I'm going to go back just for a second, right? So when we talk about Galatians, we're talking about the area of Galatia. And so you think about all the time he spent in Iconium, Lystra, right? Which is actually, again, where he actually meets Timothy. And then Antioch, these areas, this is what we're talking about when he talks about writing to the Galatians, or to the book of the letter to the Galatians. Okay. And his assumption is that when I write a letter, you're going to share that letter. And sometimes actually while he's writing, he'll say, please give this letter to, after you're done reading it, please give it to someone. So it was written after his first journey, and his first journey took 18 months. That was the 18 months time. And that was kind of the first journey to the Galatia area from Antioch. Again, that was kind of his base area. And the book of Galatians, as we look at it, it really showcases, and very, very early on, if we're talking 49, 50 AD, we're talking 17, 18, 20 years between the death and resurrection of Jesus and the spread of the gospel, as far from Jerusalem to Galatia, that it had spread that far, and actually farther than that. But in that time, there was already controversies, and we're talking about theological controversies at this point. The Judaizers, which what those were, they were Jewish Christians that believed that Christians must adhere to the Jewish law to therefore accept the grace of Jesus Christ. So they were going out after a lot of the apostles,
Go back there so you.
like Paul.
Are you
They,
listening to this?
they were going out and they were preaching, you must be circumcised, you must follow the Levitical law of sacrifice, you must do all these things. Obviously, that's wrong, right? We know that's wrong. But the book of Galatians was really written because that was one of the first areas that Paul had interacted with. And then as after his journey, he finds out these Judaizers have come in to the area of Galatia, to the Galatian church, and begin to say to them, you must be circumcised to accept Jesus Christ, to be a full Christian, to really be part of the Jewish sect of Christianity, then you must do this. So Paul writes to them and say, you don't have to do that. And here's a tie-in. Book of Acts, again, when I talk about, we can look at Acts and we can find it in the books of the letters. So Acts chapter 15, verse 1 through 30. This was written, they believe that his letter to Galatians was actually written before the Jerusalem Council. Well, the first Jerusalem Council actually met to talk about this specific issue. Okay. And so Paul was actually already dealing with it. And then when he goes to Jerusalem, along with Peter and the others, James, who's the leader of the church, the brother of Jesus, right? That they come and they're talking about the Judaizers, what they're saying, and what rules should we have Gentiles follow? Because the Jews, the majority of Jews, were still following their Levitical law, circumcision, not eating unclean animals, not eating with unclean people, Gentiles, right? They were still following that, but the movement of the gospel had went so radical from only Jews to now Gentiles. Their heads were just swirling, trying to figure out, how do we tell them, what is it we tell them to do or not to do? Okay. And so if you read the book of Acts chapter 15, verse 1 through 30, you see that they actually draw up a plan. And the plan basically says that they don't have to be circumcised, but what they do have to do is avoid eating like meat that's been sacrificed to idols, because it's talking about some other issues at that point. So they make this letter, and that's what happens, Jerusalem Council. And so with the book of Galatia, the letter to the Galatians, right, along with the Jerusalem Council, we see the church's first crisis managed, how they were going to manage it from a church itself, and how they were going to send that out. So if you think about, like, even in our day and age today, there's a lot of hypocrisy, there's a lot of stuff that's going on, and how will the denominations or the churches really deal with that? And so this was the first great example of how the early church dealt with their first hypocrisy, their first major theological controversy. And they did that by bringing the leaders of the church together and having debate and talking, and it's an interesting, read it, because it's an interesting talk between Peter and Paul at some point on what's going on, right? The book of Galatia as well is interesting. It's its harshest letter. And I would equate it, this is Pastor James talking. This is his first church. This is the one he's really set up and loved on. And then all of a sudden they've fallen away from everything he taught them. He taught them that the grace comes through faith and not by works. He taught them that they're not called to live like other people, and they're not, they've been grafted in. And so they don't have to do the law and live by the law. in the essence of, again, the concept that it was grace that bought it for you. So Paul's words here are really harsh. He talks about things like, I wish those that were talking about circumcision would go all the way, if you guys know what I mean. Right. So he's really talking about that concept. So, but the main theme then out of the book of Galatia is the law doesn't provide salvation, only grace does, but don't abuse grace. You know, it's that middle ground of understanding, okay, I don't live by the law, meaning the law cannot save me, but even though the law can't save me, it doesn't mean I can go on sinning. Right. And that's the book of Galatia, or the letter to the Galatians itself, that region. And that's how we attack it. We begin to recognize, okay, he's truly dealing with the first major theological controversy of the church itself by his letter to the Galatians. Any questions on that? I know I throw a lot of information, so I don't want to miss anything.
That you're saying a church is not is when they call it a church, is that like a community?
No, it's still ecclesia. It's still the concept of what we would call a church today. But like our denomination and so many others, we have multiple churches in our area, in our denomination. We live in a area, we live in a region, what we call a region, right? Um, and so in our region, we have about 45 churches roughly that compose our region. And then those regions are broken down by districts. And there are I think I should know this. I think there are 8 churches in my district, our district. I'm the district overseer, right? So that's why I should know this number. There are 8 that are in this area. So like Paul, I would write to the 8 churches. So I would say, like, I think my district's called Chicagoland, South Chicagoland, right? So I would write to South Chicagoland Church. I don't mean, the Sauk Village Church or the Markham Church or the Dalton Church or I don't mean those specifically. I'm writing to the church. Does that make sense? So the 8 churches that make up the South Chicago Church. So when he wrote to Galatia, he's writing to multiple churches. They're all dealing with a very similar situation, a similar issue, because if we kind of remember that map from Jerusalem to Galatia, it's kind of one of the major first stopping points. So they'd kind of gone into those Judaizers had gone into that region and began to work. So, but the churches still were like similar to our concept. You have a main leader. You hear about house churches, but again, there are some churches that met actually in synagogues or wherever they can meet. And we read about other like house churches, Lystra, some other areas that they had churches in a house. And we're not talking a lot of times really small churches either. They could have very large amount of individuals, because some of those houses, they have flat roofs. We kind of know that from the history. So they would meet on top of the roof. You could pack a lot of people in there. Or again, if you remember Paul, he's writing one point, and it's so packed that someone's sitting on the window several stories up, and then he falls asleep because he got bored because Paul kept talking, right? So Guy, does that answer that question?
Somewhat. So when he would
Somewhat.
write a letter to a church or a region,
Yes.
they would have like a little council like we do today, and they would all hear it. Then they'd break off and take it back to each of their buildings.
Yeah. And in some cases, what would happen is say, I'm not Paul, but say I'm Paul, right? And so I write to, well, I wouldn't write to my church, but let's say I write to the Dalton New Life Celebration, that they receive the letter first, okay? And then what they would do is they would have somebody from Dalton then walk it over to, let's say Markham would be next, and then Markham would take it to Bridgeview, and then Bridgeview would take it to, and so they would share the letter after they've read it, and they would read it publicly, right? So these weren't private letters. I would, as the pastor, I would say, hey, hey, it's Sunday morning or Saturday, right? It's Saturday, and it's time for church. I'm going to read to you Paul. Paul wrote to us, and this is what he said, and he would begin to, the pastor, the leader of that church at that point would begin to read the letter itself. And then when they were done with it, then they would march that letter on to another church in the area.
Were there instances where he wrote letters? Because it seems like it would take quite a while for that to circulate.
Yes.
So were there instances where he wrote specific things that by the time it got around to the end was outdated or
it could, yeah, I mean, it definitely could have. We don't know that. I'll talk a little bit more about the letter concept in a minute, but yeah, and Galatia is a different one because it's not one specific church in that larger area. But like when he writes to Ephesus, that's actually a huge city, a huge populous city. And so there were multiple churches. So that circulated very, very quickly, because it would be one Sunday, if you want to think about it like from a Sunday. So in a couple of Sundays, he would have covered everybody, they would have sung that. And again, these letters are the lifeblood for these individuals. They've got the Old Testament. They don't have the New Testament, right? Because it's not been written yet, so this is the only thing they know doctrine wise, other than the time that Paul or any of the other apostles have spent time with them. That's the only theology they get. Or when they would send some of their leaders, or Paul would, to like Jerusalem or other areas to begin to share. So you saw a lot of the regional guys. So like, let's say the pastors of Ephesus would come together and they would meet and they would dialogue as well. So there was a lot of those meetings, which is similar to what we do today in this district thing. That's why there's a district overseer, try to work with the different pastors and help them. And that's why we have regions again. So we're meeting on a regular basis, hopefully on a regular basis, to talk doctrine and philosophy and how we run churches and the issues that we're going through, both legal and financial and just spiritual. Good questions. Any others? All right. So let's go to the second letter that he wrote. Again, could be the first one. Is the church to Thessalonica, So written shortly, or again, right 51 AD, roughly in that area. Again, another church is planted by Paul. Acts chapter 17. Some great information you can read about the church in Thessalonica, right? Timothy, this is one that we've already heard about Timothy. So Timothy returns, shares there strong. What I mean by that, Paul would a lot of times, as he visited, he would then send co-workers, what he called co-laborers, that had been on trips with them to certain areas and go, hey, go check on these guys, make sure that they're okay. I can't be in two places at once. I've got to go here. I've got to do this. Hey, Timothy, hey, Titus, hey, Luke, hey, he tells all these people, and we read about them in his letters, that they go out. And so he's gone out. Basically what has happened is he's planted the church, and then he goes a little bit farther and he sends, and I don't know, and I don't know if he felt something or just wanted to make sure and check on this early church. But he sends Timothy on his way to go check on him, because this first letter is in response to Timothy's return. So it's a short amount of time, actually, while he's on his journey. It's a short amount of time after he's planted this church. And the reason for the letter is young believers. And he's telling them, you need to mature in your faith. You need to secure your hope. So both books, both letters of Thessalonians, again, are written at two different times. Okay. They're not, don't think of them written at the same time. The first one was written after Timothy's return, and the second one is written as after that point. But he tries to tell these young believers, you know, that are going through persecution at this point, you know, because again, that's kind of the norm for what was happening in that area. They had very little peace. There was years of peace, but most of it was filled with persecution. His main theme was the second coming will happen, but don't stop working and keep your hope fixed. Because even though he wasn't really dealing with a theological issue, any major crisis that was coming on, one of the problems that the early church had, and I've seen it in my lifetime, that certain churches got so wrapped up in the second coming, they kind of closed their doors and are just focused on the second coming. And the church of Thessalonica was doing very similar. Some had stopped working and actually stopped going out and making money, because like the imminent return of Jesus Christ is so much here. I'm not going to miss it. I'm going to spend every second in the church. I'm going to spend every second I can. But guess what? They became a drain on the church, because unlike most of our churches, you know, we don't have the funds, and we're not like the early Acts church where we had all things in common, and this person sold his property for them, right? That's what they lived in. And so what was happening is some of these people were going, oh, Jesus is coming back. I don't have to work anymore. And then now they became a drain on the church itself, because those that kept working now had to pay for those that were slacking. You know, so he was writing to them and say, hey, mature Christians, understand, yes, the second coming is happening, but that doesn't stop us from working, right? Or going out into the world, or living I say normal life. What it does is help us with our hope. That's where our hope is found during persecution, during struggles. We know Jesus is coming back, but don't stop living. Don't stop doing what you should be doing, what you know, because you shouldn't be a drain on the church. You should be a help. There may be moments where you know things happen, and the church is going to have to step up and help you, but the church can't step up and help you, you know, if everyone else is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so his letter was really in that. The very, very immature Christians, majority they say would have been Greek, so Gentile believers, some Jewish, right? But which was kind of a norm for that day. Again, the Jews were widespread because of what had happened. So that was kind of the theme. So when you read Thessalonians, that's kind of what you're reading, is this idea of he lays out a great doctrine for theology for the second coming, but reminds us, until he comes, make sure you're busy and make sure you're maturing. Any questions on Thessalonians? That one's kind of a quicker one, but so the next letter, a couple years later, again in his journey, is written to the Corinthians. Again, it's a two-parter. We'll find out in a minute. It's actually more than that. Again, it was a church planted by Paul. Acts chapter 18. You can kind of read a little bit about Corinthians, but it wasn't his first letter written. First Corinthians was not his first letter written to the church of Corinth. There was actually another letter. He actually talks about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, that he wrote a letter. That letter, unfortunately, has been lost. We're not sure what happened to it. He writes and talks about how sorrowful that he was for writing that letter. So, you know, thought is that it was very, very harsh. And he probably said, maybe he said things he didn't want to say. Maybe that's why it got destroyed. We're not sure. We just know that there was originally another letter written, right? And then let me see. Visited Corinth. Yeah. So he visited Corinth after the first letter, but before his second letter, right? So if you kind of think of that, so he had actually wrote them in advance and then showed up and then wrote his first, what we call First Corinthians, right? And then his fourth letter, which is actually Second Corinthians, because the third letter that he wrote was also another one that we read about that got lost. So Paul wrote 4 letters to the church of Corinth. The first and the third were all lost. The fourth letter, or what we call Second Corinthians, this is again where we see another one of his co-laborers, in this case Titus, coming back and giving a good word, a good report. Hey, the church of Corinth is doing good, you know. And remember, think about it. We got to put ourselves in Paul's spot. You know, Paul becomes very, very concerned because remember, his first, baby, his first church, the Galatians, they go off the rocker and they start thinking that they've got to become Jewish and do circumcision and not believing that Christ is enough, what his work is enough for salvation. So we're seeing now this pattern of Paul where he plants a church and immediately sends somebody and says, hey, go check on my kids, go check on my babies, right? And so here in the church of Corinth, he does the same thing. He sends Titus, a co-laborer, what he calls a co-laborer, to go. Titus comes back, so he writes his second letter, right? And so kind of the main themes of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. First is Christian conduct in the local church. He's trying to help them. This is how you live. Corinth, again, is another big city. It's a metropolis, right? It's huge, bunch of people, bunch of life. There's, the Greek, obviously Greek gods, Roman gods, this worship of that. So he's trying to tell them this is what it looks like to live in a Christian church. Because again, what they didn't know any of that stuff. You're talking about an area that had a lot of what they call temple prostitutes, a lot of sacrificing to their gods in different ways. So he's saying this is what we should do to live in a church. And then the second one, after Titus comes back, says, hey, they're holding strong to what we taught them. They're continued in their faith. He starts talking to them about giving, and then he started defending his apostleship. Because the other thing that we see with Paul is that right behind Paul, not only did he deal with the Judaizers who were trying to say, hey, you got to turn into Judaism, you've got to sacrifice or do circumcision. He also looks and turns, and what happens is people come behind him and begin to question Paul's authority, his apostleship, and begin to question what he's doing. Because it's not only the Judaizers, but it's other sects begin to come into this and begin to question Paul and his ability to really lead. And who is Paul? In fact, we talk about him, or he talks about that in some of the letters, talking about those, like, you were baptized under this person, you were baptized, and they begin to question him because Paul was not an original disciple. Okay. Remember, he was one who came and was putting into prison and killing people of the way. And so he wasn't a original disciple of Jesus. So they begin to come behind him and say, why are you guys listening to this guy? He used to persecute the way. He doesn't know Jesus. He never met Jesus. We met Jesus, or we spent time. And I'm not saying that any of the original disciples did that, the original 11, right? But we do know of other individuals that were around Jesus during that time frame and that didn't persecute him, that went out and began to bring doubt about Paul's ability to be an apostle. And so we see this theme going from now on, with this book of Corinthians through the later letters as well, defending himself. These are the things where we get to the point where he starts talking about these apostles, these super Christians, super apostles. He needs to use that word because they're coming in and saying, oh, we're greater than all these other guys. And they say, you got to give me all this money. It kind of reminds me of televangelist, you got to give me all this money if you want to be blessed. And Paul's like, I worked for my money. I was a tent maker. I didn't make you guys pay me anything. All right. And so he begins this defense everywhere he goes. One of the marks that follows Paul is this concept of someone's going to come behind him and begin to question his authority. And that's just like the enemy to do that, right? To come behind us and try to get people to second guess what we've done, the ministry that's gone on. And then we get in the book of Romans, which comes next. Now, again, Romans was written in 56 AD. He didn't visit Rome until 60s AD. Okay, so this to me, if I can get every Christian to study Romans, I'd be a happy man, because Romans is not only the longest letter, but it's the most profound in its theological background. It will teach you the plan of salvation. What does salvation mean, right? So again, it was written, we can read about it in Acts chapter 19, prior to his arrest, prior to his journey to Rome. And it was sent, the letter was sent way ahead. He desired, he talks about it a lot in the book of Acts. I desire to go to Rome, right? So he had this desire to go, but what he thought he would do is he would write this letter to the Romans, get them on a theological standpoint so they knew what was going on, so that by the time he got there, he wouldn't have to spend a lot of time laying a foundation. He was trying to build a foundation. That's why Romans is so important for Christians today, is that a lot of Christians don't have a very strong background. They don't have a strong foundation, right? The book of Romans gives you a strong foundation. You read Romans, you'll know what Christianity is about. You'll know why Jesus died, why he lived the life he did, why he had to come to the earth. You'll know why we're supposed to live, how we're supposed to live. That's what the book of Romans does. And it's such a wealth of information right in that small amount of time. All right, it is 7:49. I got a couple more minutes, but I'm gonna stop right there and ask any questions so far.
If you had to say one or another, which would you prefer people read and studied, Acts or Romans?
Romans.
Quick answer.
Yeah. Well, and the reason is I love Acts. Acts is my favorite. You guys know I've done that huge work on Acts. But Acts is, let me say, Acts is fun to read.
I think so.
Again, this is my opinion. Acts is fun to read because it is so quick. The movement is so quick. There's so much going on, and these people are visiting there and this miracle. And so it's a fun book to read. Not that Romans is not a fun book, but Romans makes you think, and from a side point of, any Christian, I want them to read Romans, because if you have a base knowledge of, you have a solid foundation that you get in the book of Romans, then you're set, and then you can read Acts. And again, Acts is that great book as a companion to the other letters, because now you get to see, like I keep pointing out, oh, this was Acts chapter 17, this is 15, this is where he was at. You get to read these stories. We're getting into, we'll probably get into it next week. Paul, like the Paul and Silas in prison. You guys remember that story, an earthquake and the guard's going to kill himself. Well, we get to read the letter that's written to that church and what happened in that area, And so that's why it's such a great companion. It's good to know. And there's a lot of in-depth, and if you've watched any of those videos, you'll see how in-depth I go in the book of Acts. But Romans is so much more powerful than that, because of the base level, that foundation that it gives you, that's necessary for our lives.
Nelson,
Yes, sir.
I think when he went to Rome, the idea that he was coming there to change their way of living.
Yes.
He wasn't coming there for that. He was coming to build a foundation for a church that he was going to talk about there. But they had the idea that he was coming there to say, this is what you guys got to start doing. This, can't do that no more. In other words, you can't drink it. You have to do this. And I think that's when he got a little bit into trouble. So he had to back and start back to where in the first book, when he was saying, no, I'm going from church to church doing this, And I'm doing the same thing in the first church as I'm doing in your church, writing your letter, building a foundation to what you should be doing and how it should be done. Not that I'm telling you what to do. No, I'm not telling you that. That's not what I'm saying to you. What I'm saying to you is this is what you should do.
Yeah, in the thing with Rome, we don't think about sometimes. Rome was again massive, right? I mean, we're talking about the Romans. You know, they're leading. So Rome is the capital of the world, if you want to think of it that way. Paul desires to go there, not to plant a church. There's already churches in Rome. From Acts chapter 2, we know that there were individuals from Rome that were in Jerusalem the day of Pentecost that received Jesus Christ and took the gospel, and that there were others that had gone up to Rome already. Paul was laying a foundation because he wanted to strengthen what he thought was the capital of the world, and wanted to make sure that they had a good, solid foundation to build upon. And he wanted to go to Rome thinking he would travel on his own accord, but God had other plans that I'm going to send you in chains. I'm going to really mess up the whole world. I'm not sending you to Rome on your own. I'm going to send you in chains up there because I'm going to send you to a different group of people. I'm not sending you to the Romans, the churches that you're writing to. I'm actually sending you to the leaders. You know, I'm sending you to these kings and these queens. I'm sending you, and there's so many cool stories about what happened to Paul, obviously prior to his death, but then even when he was in chains under Nero, who ended up executing him, just what had happened. Because what ends up going on is that Paul begins to lead people to Christ that he would have never impacted if he went on his own, right? There are stories and stories that are written from centurions and others. They end up, get this, this is one of my favorite stories. They end up having to change the guard on Paul on a regular basis, more regular than they would anyone else. They put him into a pit, right? And what they recognize, if they left the guard there too long, Paul would convert him to Christianity. Exactly. So they had to get to the point in Rome where they had to change the guard more regularly, or else he would become a Christian. You know, that was Paul. Now think about, again, if Paul didn't go to Jerusalem, get arrested in Jerusalem, and he got really arrested because of all of his work with the Gentiles. The Jewish people didn't like that. So he gets arrested in Jerusalem, appeals to Caesar, which sends him to Rome. And again, so he finally goes to Rome, where he originally wants to go to the churches, but he ends up going to the non-Christians and does his greatest work with the non-Christians, not the Christians.